Hello, my lovelies. How are you today? Good, I hope. Today, I want to discuss infamous serial killers with you. There's something to be said about the tingles and thrills that you can get knowing that you're safe in your own home, even though these monsters have walked among us. Here what follows. It's a short compiled list. I'll be discussing some of the most infamous serial killers, and we'll talk about female serial killers as well, and how they differentiate between the men. And then we'll talk about mental illnesses that they may or may not have had. If this live goes well, I may consider making it a type of series. There's a lot of ground to get covered here, so why don't we get started? And I hope that you enjoy your time here, and while it may be scary to think about, I hope that it takes your mind off whatever worries you have at this current time. I hope that you find it informative and enjoyable in some sort of way. So, let's dive right into it. A serial killer is a typical person who kills 3 or more people, with the murders taking place over more than a month and including a significant period of time between them. The FBI defines serial murder as a series of 2 or more murders committed as separate events, usually but not always, by one offender acting alone. Psychological gratification is the usual motive for serial killing, and many serial murders involve sexual contact with the victim. The FBI states that the motives of serial killers can include anger, thrill-seeking, financial gain, and attention-seeking, and killings may be executed as such. The victims may have something in common, for example, demographic profile, appearance, gender, or race. Often the FBI will focus on a particular pattern serial killers follow. Based on this pattern, this will give key clues into finding the killer along with their motives. In classifying types of serial murder, the factors discussed are behavioral background, victim profiles, methods used, and location of the murders. 4 types of serial murders are identified: the visionary, the mission-oriented, hedonistic, and power control-oriented. Serial killers may be transient or geographically stable, but can be categorized into 4 major types according to motivation. The visionary type attributes his crime to visions or voices directing the killing. This type could be termed psychotic. The mission-oriented killer sees his goal as eliminating an identifiable group of people such as prostitutes or young women. The hedonistic type kills for the pleasure derived from the act of killing. And finally, the power control-oriented type derives gratification from exerting control over a helpless victim. While each of these types and their crimes have distinguishing characteristics, a general profile of serial killers indicates that they are generally white males from age 25 to 34. They are charismatic, intelligent, and mobile. They generally kill in ways that have involved contact with the victim. Initially, their killings may be elaborately planned, but later they kill more in a panic or frenzy. Many were abused as children, and many abuse alcohol and drugs. Serial killing is intimately tied to its broader social and historical setting, something that is particularly apparent when such killing is considered in relation to a series of broad historical changes that have occurred over approximately the past 400 to 500 years, commonly associated with the rise of modernity. So while throughout human history there have probably been individuals who engaged in serial predation in previous areas, it was not possible for an individual to be a serial killer. Serial killing is a distinctly modern phenomenon, a product of relatively recent social and cultural conditions, which criminologists can provide fresh insight by accentuating the broad institutional frameworks, motivations, and opportunity structures within which serial killing occurs. Serial killing is the rarest form of homicide, occurring when an individual has killed 3 or more people who were previously unknown to him or her, with a cooling-off period between each murder. This definition is accepted by both police and academic experts and therefore provides useful frame of reference. Although serial killings are rare, the United States' fascination with them makes more sense when you keep in mind that the U.S. has the most serial killings of any country in the world. We are also, unfortunately, home to some of the most notorious serial killers of all time. While every state in America has produced at least one serial killer, some states are worse than others. Some are the birthplace of dozens of serial killers, while others are home to only a few. Coming in at number 1, we have New York. As of 2023, New York has been home to 18 serial killers and has a total number of 677 serial killer victims. David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, is New York's most infamous serial killer. From 1976 to 1977, Berkowitz murdered 6 people and wounded 11. He earned the moniker Son of Sam after the police received a letter in which he referred to himself by that name, which is a reference to his next-door neighbor. Berkowitz believed his neighbor's dog was possessed and wanted to kill him. He was sentenced to life in prison on May 18, 1978. California is in second place for the number of serial killers, but first place by almost double for the number of serial killer victims. Excuse me, I have to get a drink. California has 15 serial killers who slew over 1,770 innocent victims. California is home to several of the most notorious serial killers of all time, which accounts for the exceedingly high kill rate. The Zodiac Killer, whose work has been described as the most famous unsolved case in American history, terrorized Southern California between 1968 and 1969 in taunting letters to the police. He claimed to have murdered 37 men and women. Of the 37, 7 have been confirmed, 5 dead and 2 survivors. The case remains open to this day. Texas accounts for 8 serial killers and 948 victims, putting them in second place for number of victims, although that is still a shocking 829 victims behind California. One of Texas's most awful serial killers is Genene Jones, aka the Angel of Death, who in the early 80s killed between 11 and 46 innocent children while working as a pediatric nurse. Genene would inject the children as young as 1 month old with lethal doses of drugs that would induce fatal paralysis or heart failure. She's been sentenced to life in prison and won't be eligible for parole until she's 87 years old. From Illinois, there have been 7 serial killers, with a total count of 680 victims. They are the only state on this list to have the same ranking for both killers and victims, as they are in 4th place for both. John Wayne Gacy, commonly known as the Killer Clown, is one of the most well-known serial killers in U.S. history. And he is from Illinois, and he was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Ohio has the same amount of serial killers as Illinois, 7, but it's ranked lower due to the fact that it has fewer serial killer victims at 505 total. Their most notorious serial killer is John Gray, who raped and murdered 5 young women between 2006 and 2016. In September 2016, the police received a 911 call from a woman who just whispered that she had been kidnapped and was currently only a few feet away from her sleeping kidnapper. 911 tried to reach out to her, coaxing her out of the home. She accidentally woke him up, and the race to find her before she became his next victim began. When the police arrived at the scene, they found trash piled up to the ceiling and multiple decomposing bodies. Gray was arrested and is scheduled to be executed in 2025. Indiana is the home state to 6 serial killers who in total killed 349 victims. This puts it at 6th on the list of serial killers, but only 12th on the list of victims. Herb Baumeister was a prominent businessman from Indiana who lived on an 18-acre estate with his wife and 2 children. In June 1996, the skeletal remains of 11 missing young men from the Indiana gay community were found on his property, leading Baumeister to take his own life before he could be charged. Infamous serial killers from Louisiana also include Henry Lee Lucas, the Deadly Drifter, Ronald Joseph Dominique, the Bayou Killer, and Danny Rowland, the Gainesville Ripper. In 8th place is Pennsylvania, with 5 serial killers. The 5 killers from Pennsylvania were responsible for 462 deaths, which outranks both Indiana and Louisiana. Some of the most notorious killers are as follows. Jeffrey Dahmer started killing in 1978, just 18 years old, and wasn't arrested for murder until 1991. After a would-be victim escaped and led police back to Dahmer's Milwaukee, Wisconsin home. It was there that some of the gruesome details of his life of killing were seen via photos of mutilated bodies and body parts strewn across the apartment. He even had a vat of acid he used to dispose of victims. In all, Dahmer killed 17 people, mostly young men of color. He served time in prison twice, the first time for molestation and the second time for murder, and was killed by a fellow inmate in 1994. Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death, is believed to have killed an estimated 250 patients. This doctor practiced in Greater Manchester, England. Between 1972 and 1998, he worked in 2 different offices, killing all the while. He wasn't caught until a red flag was raised by several people, including Undertaker, who was surprised by the sheer number of cremation certificates. Shipman was a part of along with the fact that most of the cases were elderly women found to have died in bed not at night, but rather during the day. Police mishandled the investigation, and Shipman kept killing until he got greedy and tried to concoct a will for a victim that named him beneficiary, which led the victim's daughter to become suspicious. He was finally convicted in 2000 and committed suicide while in prison in 2004. A construction worker known by his suburban neighbors as outgoing, John Wayne Gacy was involved in politics and even acted as a clown for birthday parties. Gacy came under suspicion in 1978 when a 15-year-old boy last seen with him went missing. Soon after, a search warrant granted police access to the Gacy home, with the smell of nearly 30 bodies buried in a 4-foot crawlspace under his home. He was convicted of 33 counts of murder, with additional counts of rape and torture, and was executed by lethal injection in 1994. Chicago has had its share of serial killers. but perhaps none more haunting than H. H. Holmes, the pharmacist who turned a hotel into a torture castle. Ahead of the 1893 World's Fair, Holmes moved to Chicago and started outfitting a three-story hotel with all manner of nefarious contraptions, including gas lines, secret passages and trapdoors, hallways to dead ends, chutes to the basement, soundproof padding, and torture devices strewn throughout a maze. The gas allowed Holmes to knock out his guests before the worst of what was to happen came next, often on his surgical tables. He then burned the bodies in the building's furnace, selling skeletons to medical schools and running life insurance scams. In all, he copped to more than 30 murders, found only after a fellow scammer turned him in for falling short on a financial agreement before he was hanged in 1896. Ted Bundy loved attention. His murders garnered him, and many in the United States were more than happy to give him that attention. The western U.S. was his hunting ground, with an unknown number of murders piling up, mostly college-age women from Washington and Oregon all the way to Utah and Colorado. Bundy was once arrested in Colorado and convicted of kidnapping, but he escaped custody, moving to Florida where he killed multiple times more. Bundy's final arrest and its aftermath captured the attention of the nation, as the murderer acted as his own lawyer during what is believed to have been the first televised murder trial, welcomed interviews, and boasted of fans he had created. He was eventually executed in an electric chair in 1989. Richard Ramirez was an American serial killer who murdered at least 14 people and was convicted of attempting to murder 5 others. After developing epilepsy as a child, he became a heavy drug user and cultivated an interest in Satanism, which became a calling card for investigators at his crime scenes. He committed at least 30 violent crimes that often included rape and torture, mostly during the spring and summer of 1985. Apprehended in August of that year, Ramirez was sentenced to death at the conclusion of his trial in 1989. He spent the remainder of his days at California's San Quentin prison before dying from cancer in June 2013 at age 53. The self-proclaimed Zodiac Killer is directly linked to at least 5 murders in Northern California in 1968 and 1969, with 2 other victims surviving despite serious injuries. Through correspondence, he claimed to have killed as many as 37 people. Despite intensive investigations and multiple theories pertaining to the killer's identity, no one was ever caught for the crimes, and the case remains open. From August 7th to September 10th in 1888, Jack the Ripper terrorized Whitechapel district in London's East End. He killed at least 5 prostitutes and mutilated their bodies in an unusual manner, indicating that the killer had a knowledge of human anatomy. He was never caught and remains England's and the world's most infamous criminals. Norwegian-born Belle Gunness immigrated to the U.S. in 1881. A series of suspicious fires and deaths, mostly resulting in insurance awards, followed. Belle also began posting notices in lovelorn columns to entice wealthy men to her farm, after which they were never seen again. Authorities eventually found remains of over 40 victims on her property, but Belle disappeared without a trace. Since men perpetrate about 90% of the world's homicides, it makes sense that nearly all of history's most notorious serial killers are men. But they do have a small number of counterparts, and they are just as deadly. Many of these women used arsenic as their deadly weapon, and some killed over 100 people. Here's a list of a few of the most famous serial killers: Aileen Wuornos, Judith Bueno, Juana Barraza, Jane Toppan, Gesh Gottfried, Amelia Dyer, Christian Gilbert, Nanny Doss, Dorothea Puente, Miyuki Ishikawa, Elizabeth Bathory. Serial killer Aileen Wuornos was convicted for murdering 6 men in Florida in 1989 and 1990. Wuornos had exhibited unusual sexual behavior as a child before leaving home as a teen and had multiple brushes with the law by the 1980s. When she made a living as a sex worker on Florida's highways, her killing spree started around late November 1989 and earned her the nickname Damsel of Death. After being arrested in January 1991, she confessed to 7 murders before receiving death sentences in the 6 cases brought against her. Although her sanity was questioned, Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in 2002 at age 46. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a wealthy and powerful Hungarian noblewoman whose relations included an uncle who was king of Poland and a nephew who was prince of Transylvania. In 1610, she was accused of gruesome acts of serial murder and confined to her home of Castle Cathtis, where she remained until her death. Bathory is reputed to have killed at least 600 victims, earning her a Guinness World Record for most prolific female murderer. Her actions resulted in the nickname of the Blood Countess, and many have been a source of inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. However, it's possible Bathory was not guilty of all the crimes that have been laid at her feet. Judy Bueno killed her husband, James Goodyear, according to NBC News, her son Michael Bueno, her boyfriend Bobby, Joe Morris, and potentially her boyfriend Gerald Dossett. She was also believed to have been involved in the 1974 murder in Alabama and attempted to murder her fiancé, John Gentry. Rana was executed in 1971 for the murder of her husband. She was later linked to many of the other murders. She was the first woman to be executed in Florida since 1848 and was the 3rd woman to be executed in the U.S. since the reinstatement of the capital punishment in 1976. Joana Barraza was a Mexican professional wrestler. She was born in 1957 and was known as the Old Lady Killer. She murdered between 42 and 48 elderly women and was later sentenced to 759 years in prison. She would beat her or strangle her victims and steal their possessions. She was caught in 2006 and found guilty of 16 counts of murder and aggravated burglary in 2008, according to the New York Daily News. Jane Toplan, at the age of 24, was a nurse who went on a killing spree that started with her family, friends, and by the end had 31 victims. Her method was poison through injection, and upon confessing was declared insane and was committed. Gesche Gottfried. Gottfried was a German female serial killer who was the last person publicly executed in the city of Bremen. She killed 15 people using arsenic, probably between the years 1813 and 1827. She would mix the poison in with her victims' food while caring for them as a nurse, reports New York Daily News. She killed her parents, her 2 husbands, her fiancé, and her children. Amelia Dyer. Dyer is only convicted of 1 murder, but her name is attached to the murder of hundreds of infants and children. She worked for 20 years at the baby farm, according to the New York Daily News. It is suspected that she killed over 400 infants, which would make her among history's most prolific female serial killer. She was tried for murder in 1896 and convicted and hanged. Gilbert was a nurse who was convicted of 4 murders and 2 attempted murders of patients admitted to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Massachusetts. She would inject patients with massive doses of epinephrine, which is an untraceable heart stimulant. This would cause cardiac arrest, and she would respond to the coded emergency herself. She was convicted in 1998. She is serving a life sentence at Federal Medical Center, Carswell, in Fort Worth, Texas. Nanny Doss killed 11 people between 1920s and 1954, including 4 of her husband's 2 children, her 2 sisters, her mother, a grandson, and mother-in-law. She was known as the Giggling Granny, the Lonely Hearts Killer, the Black Widow, the Lady Bluebeard. Her main method of murder was rat poison. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment. She died in 1965. Dorothea Puente. Puente ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, and murdered her elderly and mentally disabled boarders. She would then cash in their Social Security checks. She was often called Death House Landlady. She was charged with a total of 9 murders. Puente was convicted of 3 and sentenced to 2 life sentences. She died in 2011 in prison in Chowchilla at the age of 82. Miyuki Ishikawa. Was a Japanese midwife. She murdered infants with the help of accomplices during the 1940s, reports New York Daily News. Estimates suggest that she murdered between 85 and 169 people, but the general estimate is 103. She sought payment for the murders, since many of her victims were deserted children, and she said her services cost less than raising an unwanted child. She received a 4-year sentence. The single biggest drive for male serial killers is sexual compulsion. That's not to say that all male serial killers will rape their victims. Far from it, but on some level, there is generally a sexual element, even if it's purely psychological. Male multiple murders are often compelled to kill. An innate urge drives them to take the lives of others. Compare that to female serial killers, and we see a polar opposite. When a woman kills, there's usually a reason. There is pragmatism and justification, at least in the killer's mind anyway. Researchers found that male serial killers tend to hunt their victims, who are often strangers to them. Female serial killers tend to gather their victims, targeting people around them who they may already know, often for financial gain. After analyzing the data, the researchers found male serial killers were almost 6 times as likely to kill a stranger, while female serial killers were only nearly twice as likely to kill a person they already knew. Additionally, 65.4% of male serial killers stalk their victims, compared to 3.6% of female serial killers. Female serial killers tend to have been married at least once. Males tend to be single at the time of the first crime. Males tend to have a high school education or less. Females tend to have some college or more. As for the media's treatment of serial murders, statistical analysis found that the nickname assigned to female serial killers is more likely to convey their gender, like Tiger Woman, versus calling a man the BTK, bind, torture, kill killer. The ways in which they also kill are different. Women's primary means are poison, and men's are asphyxiation. Men are far more likely to target a stranger and have to stalk their victim. Women are more likely to target somebody familiar to them and are more than twice as likely to have murdered a spouse or partner. They tend to target the vulnerable, elderly people, ill people, or children. The archetype of the serial killer is generally thought of as the lone wolf, for the most part, that's true. But serial killing partnerships are not as rare as you may imagine. True, the most famous duos are men, Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, the Hillside Stranglers, Leonard Lake and Charles. But mixed-sex serial killers aren't unheard of. When a man and woman embark on a killing spree together, as with any partnership, there will usually be a dominant and a submissive to varying degrees. When the killers are male and female, the man will generally be the dominant driving force behind the crimes. The idea that all serial killers stalk the street for their prey are as fearsome lone wolves is something of a fallacy. A useful example of this phenomenon comes in the shape of Gerald and Charlene Gallego. Between 1978 and 1980, a married couple kidnapped, raped, and killed 10 young women. They are called the love slave killers, and would keep the women as sex slaves before murdering them. It was clear to police that, as with almost all other depraved joint ventures of this kind, that the man was the one in control. After 13 years in jail, Charlene was eventually released. In an interview she gave while a free woman, she summarized the 2-year death spree like this: "There were victims who died, and there were victims who lived. It's taken me a hell of a long time to realize that I'm one of the ones who lived." Mental illnesses have been found in some of the U.S. most loathsome killers throughout history, but it's important to note that most people suffering from these illnesses do not commit any violent offenses. These instances of mental disorders represent only a small fraction of people diagnosed, and the majority of people affected do not engage in criminal activity, especially if given proper treatment and social support. In the wake of violent assault, robbery, or murder, forensic psychologists typically examine the mental correlates of criminality in order to get the root of a behavior. These justice systems professionals will often ask such questions as: did the accused have a troubled childhood? Does he/she exhibit empathy for others? Does he/she self-medicate with drugs or alcohol? Not surprisingly, many criminals have been diagnosed with mental illnesses and may be suffering from co-occurring substance abuse. So, what are some of the most common psychological disorders associated with history's most infamous American criminals, serial killers, and terrorists in particular? Schizophrenia is one of them. According to WebMD, schizophrenia, a wide-ranging and often misdiagnosed mental illness, lists symptoms ranging from hallucination and delusions to emotional flatness and catatonia. It is one of the most common mental disorders diagnosed among criminals, especially serial killers. David Berkowitz, better known as the Son of Sam, killed 6 people in the 1970s, claiming that his neighbor's dog had told him to do it. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Ed Gein, gruesome inspiration for fictions, Norman Bates, Buffalo Bill, and Leatherface, murdered and mutilated his victims, often keeping grisly trophies. Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento, killed 6 people in California and drank their blood. David Gonzalez killed 4 people in 2004 and claimed he'd been inspired by the Nightmare on Elm Street. Jared Lee Loughner, convicted of killing 6 people and wounding 13, including U.S. Representative Gabrielle Giffords in 2011, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. James Egan Holmes, currently on trial for the 2012 Batman murders in Aurora, has been diagnosed with schizophrenia by 20 doctors. Next, there's borderline personality disorder. This disease is characterized by impulsive behaviors, intense mood swings, feelings of low self-worth, and problems in interpersonal interpersonal relationships. It has also been diagnosed among some of the U.S.'s most notorious serial killers. Interestingly, this seems more common among female criminals. Aileen Wuornos, the woman who inspired the 2003 film Monster, starring Charlize Theron, confessed to 7 murders in Florida. She was also diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, killed 17 boys and men between 1978 and 1991. He also struggled with heavy alcohol abuse. Christian H. Gilbert killed 4 patients at a Northampton, Virginia hospital where she worked as a nurse by administering fatal doses of epinephrine to induce cardiac arrest. Next, we have antisocial personality disorder, known in the past as psychopathy. This mental disorder is characterized by a total disregard of the feelings of others. People with APD may lie, act out violently, or break the law and show no remorse. While APD only affects about 0.6% of the population, it may affect up to 47% of male inmates and 21% of female inmates. It's also been diagnosed among 3 of the most ruthless American serial killers. Ted Bundy is one of them. He was an infamous serial killer, a necrophile, confessed to 30 murders in the 1970s. John Wayne Gacy, known as the Killer Clown, raped and killed 33 boys and young men in the 1970s. Charles Manson, leader of the Manson family cult and mastermind behind the 1969 murders at the home of Sharon Tate, was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. While these 3 disorders are commonly seen among violent criminals, there have also been a number of killers whom were never diagnosed with mental illnesses. For example, Dean Corll, also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper, kidnapped, raped, and killed 28 boys between 1970 and 1973 in Houston, Texas, and was never diagnosed. Additionally, Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber of 95, killed 168 people and injured over 600, and yet too was never given mental illness diagnosis. Still, mental illness in prison populations and among criminals continues to be an issue in the United States today. In order to decrease prison recidivism, rates of violent crime, it's essential that rehabilitative services and mental illness treatments be improved in this dangerous yet vulnerable population. So, it is absolutely crazy to know all this and know that it's been out there for hundreds, for all of human evolution, and was recently only categorized as something. Thank you, Miss Wood. So, I believe that's all I have. I hope that you enjoyed. I hope that you found it very informative. And I hope that you may have had a little bit of fun. I don't know when I'll be doing my next live at this time, but I have several prepared. Somewhat similar to this live and some of the others that I've done. So yeah, I'm going to say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye, my lovelies.